warm welcome to everybody who's joining us right now. My name's Blake Redding, organisational psychologist with Mappy, and excited to be hosting this session that's really about helping us work together to formulate a strong and evidence-based approach to a workplace mental health response to COVID-19. In putting the session together today, I thought we'd start pretty much on time because we're finding a lot of people are logging in straight on that time, and we want to get to it nice and fast. And I think what we're looking to share with you today is not a presentation. We have got a couple of slides, but definitely a conversation and stories from people who are working in the space right now in terms of when we think about it today, the actual impact that COVID is having on mental health in the workplace, to help us, I guess, get a sense of ourselves in terms of what that impact is, and then the people that we're supporting in the business right now. And then move into that space of what are the interventions, techniques, experiences that we're noticing of having a genuine and helpful impact for people. And then towards the end, the focus on with recovery phase starting to kick in, what are the types of things that we really need to be thinking about right now to be as prepared as we can for that recovery phase. So I guess those 3 points come together, and I'm joined on the panel by we really bring together some diverse experience where Lisa Payton, Associate Director with Mappy, is really bringing a perspective as a leadership coach, culture transformation expert, really working with leaders on the ground today, navigating some of the challenges and the opportunities that are arising right now. Mark Brady, who brings such a depth and breadth of public and private sector experience in industrial relations and employee relations to help bring a pragmatic perspective to some of the decisions and behaviours that we might be responding to and how we might be supporting people right now. And Dr. Diane Harner, the Managing Director of Clever Minds Consulting, who is a business that we partner with in the delivery of mental health support. And excited to bring her experience as having a PhD in neuroscience, counsellor, businesswoman. All of these lenses bring just an extra dimension of insight to bring us through today. And from a housekeeping perspective, most of us are probably familiar with Zoom by now. I've got the Q&A panel open in front of me. If you did have questions along the way, please do type them in, and I'll do my best to thread them through some of the questions and the comments that do come through. What we'll also be doing is sharing a summary of insights afterwards, really intended to help ensure that you've got the slides, you've got the key messages, and they can be used to help formulate, whether it be personal activities, behaviours and styles that you're wanting to share with your people if you're a leader or business owner. And then from an HR leadership perspective, the types of advice we really want to be seeing instilled in the types of processes and support that we're delivering. And I think the other piece to help us through today is, I guess, just from a language perspective, we're using that word mental health quite a lot. And from a sense of where we're coming from, we might look to the World Health Organization that really shares a definition to the effect that mental health relates to someone's ability to cope effectively with the strain that might be thrown at them in the workplace, to a degree that they're still experiencing fulfillment and they're still contributing to their community. So that's the outcome in mind when we speak to mental health. And the priority of it, I mean, everybody who's logged on and joined us today appreciates the importance of it. Pre-COVID, reports of the 12 billion impact on the economy every year. From a work cover claim perspective, 30 to 40, some people might say 50% of claims that go of people being absent for over a week will be due to mental health challenges. And 1 in 5, Australians really indicating that I've got to take time off at least once a year, because of some of the mental health challenges that I'm facing right now. And so we then sort of experience COVID and the data and the research, it's in progress at the moment, and it's variable between the different organisations that you hear from. But we are generally hearing that sense of a 20 to 30% spike in lifeline reach outs for support. Workplace wellbeing survey reported that it says about 85% generally are concerned about the virus causing a sense of anxiety, the isolation contributing to, 1 in 4 people experiencing sadness, anxiety, or depression, as a result. So the importance for all of us right now in being on the front foot, during this time, it really creates that opportunity to experience new ways of shaping mental health right now and strengthening through this experience. And so that's where I would like to invite Dr. Diane to kick off with that conversation around, as a counsellor, as a neuroscientist, how do you introduce that sense of this is the impact for all of us right now in that workplace context?
Thanks, Blake. Well, I think the first thing that we really need to get our heads around is that just like physical health, mental health exists on a spectrum, which means, some days you will have great mental health and some days you will have not so great mental health. And at any time and any day, we are somewhere on that spectrum. So what we really need to do is normalize, especially within this context, that we may be having more bad days than we're used to at the moment. So this is when we really need to be aware of how we are. We need to actually check in with ourselves to see where we are on that spectrum, and then be proactive about maintaining a good mental health. So what we need to be mindful of is when we are not bouncing back from those not so great days. And when we are spending, a few not so great days in a row. And that's when we have to start to reach out for help. So really normalizing it, understanding that, yes, there will be good days and bad days. I've had a couple of low days this week. We're all going to go through it. And I think that's the really important thing to understand here. Now, from a neuroscientific perspective, and of course, the impact on mental health is that what we're going through now is incredibly exhausting for our brain. So we are dealing with so much uncertainty and so much change, and our brain needs to navigate us through that. So what our brain would like us to do is follow all of our habits and routines and all of the things that we always do, because it uses the least amount of energy and has to think the least to do that. But what's happening now is because we're having to adjust, we're needing to take on new information, we're needing to create new routines and habits. Our brain actually needs to up its efforts in order to be able to do that. And that's why what I'm seeing is a lot more fatigue, a lot more exhaustion, a decrease in motivation, a decrease in the ability to focus. And part of that is because it is just really an exhausting time with all the change and uncertainty. So when we think about stress in particular, we also need to think about it in terms of how stress impacts our performance. And Blake, if you could just show the image that we have of the brain, I just want to take you through a little bit of neuroscience 101 about how we manage stress and how that impacts performance. So in the back part of our brain and in the middle part of our brain is where all of our sort of subconscious activity exists. It's where our survival mechanisms come from. It's also where we process emotions. Now, there's a special part of the middle part of our brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is kind of like the smoke detector of our brain, and it's responsible for detecting any threat in our environment. And when it detects threat, it starts our fight, flight, or fright response. So what's happening for our amygdala now is that it is detecting threat everywhere. Now, back when our brain was evolving, threat was a saber-toothed tiger. But now this is financial pressure. Threats are uncertainty. It's lack of social connection. It's being concerned about our performance at work. So right now, our amygdala is very, very triggered. Now, At the front part of our brain where you see the green arrow, that's called our prefrontal cortex. And that is the part of the brain that is responsible for doing all of our really cognitive tasks. That's the part of the brain where, you know, we do all of our analysis and reasoning and planning. So when we're at work, we're really using this part of the brain. And what happens when our amygdala is constantly being triggered? The ability of our prefrontal cortex to perform goes down. So what that means is, as we're really trying to manage all of these emotions and all of this threat, our prefrontal cortex, to a certain degree, goes offline. And so this is how it can affect our performance at work. Another one of the really important jobs our prefrontal cortex has is to regulate our emotions. So that the prefrontal cortex is also responsible for saying to the back of our brain, to our amygdala, everything's okay, everything is going to be fine. But the challenge is that all of this takes resource. You know, regulating emotions takes resource, doing cognitive tasks takes resource, and we only have a limited amount of resource available to our prefrontal cortex. So when our prefrontal cortex is working so hard to do all our cognitive work and manage all of the threat, that is why we're seeing this exhaustion. And this is why we're seeing mental health challenges increase, because all of those emotions that are going on at the back of our brain are getting louder and less regulated. So the other things that we're seeing as a result of this happening is that the little things that used to just be niggling in the background get amplified. And this is particularly noticeable in home environments. So when we were going out to work every day and we were having that time of separation and doing other things, we could come home and sort of be ready to engage in those interactions with our families. But now we're in very close quarters and we're not sort of getting that space for ourselves. We can have less patience with our children, for instance. You know, finding decisions about what we make for dinner particularly challenging. So we just need to have a little bit more tolerance, I guess, and try to be a little bit more patient with ourselves and also those around us, to know that these emotions are, you know, a little bit bigger at this point in time because of what we're going through. But stress isn't always bad. So if we could just look at the next slide. So this is called the Yogi's Dodson curve. So the point that I want to make here is that a little bit of stress in our lives is good, but if we're not managing our stress, that's when our performance could go down. So if you look at on the left-hand side, you see performance, and along the bottom, you see arousal stress. And for most of us, we kind of sit a little bit to the left of that peak in the curve, where that peak of the curve is what we would call sort of our high performance or peak performance state. So we sit a little bit to the left, and when we have a deadline coming up or there is some kind of stress that is increasing, it puts us into that higher level of performance. And I think we've all felt those times where a deadline was coming up and we feel like we're just doing great work really, really quickly. And that's when we're at that peak performance. Now, what happens is if we're at peak performance, but more stress is added on top, that's when we fall off the other side and we get into sort of exhaustion and fatigue and high stress and anxiety and other mental health challenges. So we need to be really aware of when we're falling off the other side of performance and proactively making sure that we shift ourselves back to that left-hand side through stress management techniques, mindfulness, grounding exercise, diet, sleep is also a good one as well. So I guess to sort of round off my comments here, it is a time where we will see an increase in mental health challenges, and we need to be accepting of that and normalize that. We also need to be increasing our awareness of where we're at and where the people around us are at, and proactively addressing our mental health challenges as they arise.
Absolutely, and I think we're getting quite familiar with curves right now, this is the neurological curve that we've really got to be mindful of, in terms of tightening it really, so that we're not falling off that cliff. And I think that's where for Lisa, in terms of working in the leader culture space at the moment right now, the types of impacts that Diane's spoken to, how are you seeing them manifest and show themselves through that lens of leaders?
So thank you, Diane, you're absolutely spot on. It's almost a direct translation of what you're saying is happening in the brain. I'm seeing in the behaviours in the workplace, and it's that fight or freeze, where you're seeing people who initially, when we first was exposed to a COVID-19, and then, well, what are we going to do about that? I saw people go into that very much, okay, we've got to do something. Other people are like, I can't make a decision. And other people are like trying to just understand their world. And how that translated is in the very first stages, when it was isolation. I was talking to a lot of leaders, and I was trying to introduce the concept of how are you going to take care of your people during this time. And the response that came back was, no, I've just got to take care of the physical environment. And I guess in the mental health and what are we doing there? But people weren't ready to hear that, because they were so on the pragmatic of trying to, number one, survive for a lot of organisations, managing the emotional fallout of actually, particularly I feel for our leaders, our business owners, our HR practitioners, anyone who's at the front line, having to have these conversations and carry the emotional, feel the emotion with people. These are significant stresses. If we go back to the WHO definition and we think about normal stresses, this is not normal. So we have to understand it's not about who is impacted. We've all been impacted. It's about to the degree that people have been impacted, and then how do we support people through this process. And I think empathy in this part is incredibly important, and the understanding that this is not normal, and at this stage we won't have the same level of productivity. However, what I'm seeing for a lot of leaders that I'm working with, particularly in very senior positions, is that the unsustainable work pace that people are working at. I'm talking to people and they're working from, they get up, so they're doing a really good thing. They go for a run in the morning, fantastic exercise, coming straight in, sitting down at the desk at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then not logging off until midnight, 1:30 in the morning. And this, and like using their weekends. And this is not quite as extreme as that for a number of people, but that's unsustainable. That is not going to contribute to our mental health. So whilst exercise can be a protective factor, the long hours and the pressure that we're under isn't going to. So it's not helping them. I think that we add to the already challenging environment, and I feel for any parent out there. As you know, I think there's a number of people on the panel today who've got kids and are trying to homeschool, and the challenge there. You've also got partners or family members in there. So we don't have our normal boundaries, as Diane said before. So we've got a lot of spillover. It's just a complete merging of our family life and our work life and all of that. So I am absolutely seeing that impact. And I think what I'm hearing now, what I expect to see is people have moved from, okay, I've got the desk set up. We've got our ergonomically correct chairs, our desks at our right height, etc., etc. Now we've got a bit of a rhythm and routine. So I know that Blake's going to call me at 9 o'clock every morning. We're going to do our morning muster. Great. The next thing I'm starting to hear people talk about was, how do I keep people accountable? In this space right now, out of sight, out of mind, is that really true? And it's like, how do we help people to go, don't micromanage? That's not the way to support people through this process. So that leadership skill is absolutely critical. But I think if I can give one piece of advice at this very moment, it's around communication. And I want you to become really comfortable with using the F word in the workplace. And by the F word, I mean feelings. We have got to start talking about what we're feeling. So it's about, and it can be a morning muster, as we've got all psychs in our team, in the Brisbane office and in the OD team. And it's like, okay, what's your feeling? And so we'll name it. and then we move on to the more productive side. Is that going to work in a construction site? Probably not. But it's still, let me check in with that person to see how they're doing. So as a leader, we must be at the forefront of this, and we have to put mental health and well-being as important as physical health and safety.
Excellent. And I think, in terms of that sense of our leaders, HR leaders, business owners are both recipients of the change right now, recipients of the stress, whilst also playing a really pivotal role. And I think where you did mention the work from home scenario, that does play a part in a lot of the stressors that are arising. And we're also noticing those impacts of where there are people who are still on the front line and can't work from home. And some of that resentment that can arise between, I guess, a new workforce segment, some of the effects, I suppose, of the fairness of how some of the hour reductions, might be applied. And I guess this is where we're introducing Mark, from your perspective, where we've been in isolation for 6 weeks or thereabouts. This abnormal impact is continuing. And how are you noticing in the work that you're doing around investigations, grievances, conflict, that you're seeing these stressors, this abnormal impact, starting to affect both people who are making allegations, people who are responding to allegations, and then the leaders or HR leaders in the middle who are advising on that? What are you seeing through your experiences?
Thanks, Blake. I think in the first instance, just to build on what both Lisa and Diane have said about the initial reaction, because it isn't a normal circumstance. We are in uncharted waters. The first sort of instinct is survival, and what that means to individuals, what that means to financial survival, what that means to paying the bills, what's that for security for your family. And that sense of insecurity is really, in my experience, is the first thing that really came across. The questions arise about the viability of your industry, the company you're working in, and whether individuals will still have a job and an income. It raises all sorts of questions then about employee entitlements, such as, is this a paid leave? Can we make employees take paid leave? Is this unpaid leave? Can they access sick leave? And two, will I still have a job at the end of it? So for the average person, and I'd say the majority of people, financial security was the initial key issue. As employers, this is not making an already complex system any easier. We already have a fairly complex system across the country as far as IR goes. So there's further complexities about questions and decisions regarding staff being forced to take leave, whether stand downs apply, and also what government initiatives mean for both employers and employees. So when faced with such uncertainty, emotions can be heightened. That may result in behaviours that in normal circumstances would be unacceptable. So as a leader, when you're faced with someone who is facing these stresses, tolerance initially is a very important quality. So what you're trying to do is reduce the moment, reduce the moment and reduce the emotion in the situation, to try and look outside of the emotion and see what the issues are. And that'll mean also make sure you have a trusted source of information to pass on good information to employees. And it's a complex time. It's okay not to know the answer. As a manager, you don't have to have every provision, every situation, at your fingertips to give an answer straight away. What you can say is you can also buy time. Say to someone, yes, I know that is a real key issue. Give me some time to find out the answer and I'll get to you as soon as possible. And keep people in the loop as far as, if it is taking a bit of time, touch base and say, hey, I haven't forgotten you. I still need to find that out. So it's really important that, that'll have a dual effect of not only getting you time to get the right information, but also helping a situation, de-escalate a little bit. And I think it's really important to know that, the complexities across the board, with the new government allowances, job seeker, job keeper, for example, in Fair Work, we've already had 120 disputes filed about the job keeper allowance. So, that it is a difficult time. And I don't think, anyone really knows the right answer right now until a couple of these cases have been decided. So, we can't be expected to be, as a manager, we can't be expected to be the holder of all knowledge. But if, now we move to the next situation where we are in isolation, and hopefully, the financial issues or the entitlements issues have been dealt with, or at least in abeyance for a while. A lot of staff are working from home if they're able to, in a lot of occasions. As Lisa alluded to, productivity is a huge issue. Performance and productivity and accountability. Everyone's home situations are different. This can affect performance. Young kids need far more attention than older kids for schooling. As an employee, that has one impact, but what does that mean for you as an employer? How do you deal with that? What do you do to deal with that? As Lisa outlines, workloads and availability are also an issue. Nowadays, most of us have our work emails on our phones, and we're looking at them regularly, and all over the weekend and that sort of time. As leaders, we have to monitor burnout, not only for ourselves, but also for our team, and make sure people are switching off. Kids at home and also other adults may not have the same work commitments as you may have. And that can also add to the burnout factor, in that you've got competing priorities that, do you really have to be at the computer again? You've been there for 4 hours. Why don't we do something with the kids? Whatever that may be these days. But, we need to encourage our staff to continue to work as normal as far as they can. That means having breaks, logging off at the end of the day, and taking your weekends. Make sure you switch off. There'll also be people who still may want to work from the office at certain times for different reasons. They might need a break from home, or be concerned about certain facilities at home, because we all know that internet connections vary on different days, and if you have something on that you think, I don't want the connection to fail, I'll go into the office. Make sure you work through that with the individuals, and make sure that you're safe and they're safe, and you stick within those COVID parameters, so that you don't attract any additional liability or risk with your staff.
Right. Thanks, Mark. And I think in terms of listening to that sort of first prompter around that sense of how's it impacting people right now, appreciating the neurological response, the neurological curve, and the reactions that we probably are all experiencing and familiar with. I guess awareness of that in these times is really supported by the evidence that says the more we understand about how our brain is responding to a situation, the better we can manage it. Because what I'm hearing a lot here is that sense of we're all in this together. We're all getting some abnormal stressors that are going to limit our effectiveness. But then there's a whole lot of things that we've got to do additionally to help cope through, which is creating the challenge in the role from a mental health perspective. And I think we are in unusual times, and the type of technology and research that we have access to now wasn't around through the previous pandemics. And I even understand that the last pandemic practice that Australia did was before the iPhone. Don't quote me on that one, but it would sort of the sort of things have changed. What is good though, we're looking to science to help, and the chief medical officers to help us with the right decisions around how do we actually beat this curve. Similarly, there is some really strong founded research around where mental health is really affected in a workplace context. And so this is where, I'd encourage the job demand and resource model as probably the go-to framework at the moment about trying to appreciate from an evidence-based perspective, what are those items that are going to create strain, stress, pressure, and push us to that right side of that curve? Because we're hearing a lot of stories right now, and we're experiencing a lot of stories. And as we try to make the difference with as many people as possible, this is where you can see the science aligned with the stories. The pace and amount of work is like nothing we've seen before. The level of ambiguity and uncertainty, is high. I think I would hope that how well we're seeing people cope with this level of ambiguity and uncertainty might start to challenge that myth that was never well founded that people aren't good at managing change. It's about how they're led through that change. And that sense of changes in tasks, how that will cause a sense of strain, that mental and emotional workload. So this is all from, research that's available to us right now and starting to tap into these are the types of things that affect us, So that can give you confidence that we're on the right track. We've heard those varying stories, and I think that's where the imbalance towards strain and burnout is where these factors are outweighing those items that we know will even that out those pressures or experiences. And I think that's where, before we looked at the research to give us that list, reflecting on our own experiences and coming to Lisa first too, is that sense of this is moving into the space of that first question is about, let's put some words, language, and normalization to what we're all experiencing right now. And let's tap into the intel that we have on this panel about, what are those interventions, behaviors, techniques, the stuff that works from an evidence perspective, and you've seen starting to work in this new context. So Lisa, from your perspective, we did start to tap into it, each of us at the first question, and I guess we're going to go probably a bit more tactical right now, that essentially would start to formulate those types of, these are the items that we're seeing in practice that are working right now. So Lisa?
Thanks, Blake. I think that this is really good. And I think that if we think back to what everyone's experiencing, the pace and the amount of work that we're having to do at this time is incredibly challenging, but it's not to say that we can't help shift that for employees. And that's what I like about using a really robust model. So number one for me is that, having a scientist kind of behavioral science background, I want evidence-based. I want a good theory or framework to work from, but then I need to make it pragmatic. So if we look at, and having been a coach for a long time, what I hear people say is, if we look at pace and amount of work, it's like, oh, they're not really that busy, or the amount of work's not that high. And it's like, even if it's a perception for the person that they're feeling overwhelmed, as a leader, we help people understand, well, what are your priorities? What can I help you with? And you help guide the person. At the moment, we don't. If we look down to the bottom one, which is the mental and emotional load, we have that. And as Diane really appropriately identified, is we're moving what we need in our frontal cortex, and it's going to our kind of reptilian brain, the amygdala and our emotion center. So I don't have the resources that I need to be able to prioritize and manage my workload as I normally would. So really practical is sitting down and helping your staff actually, okay, what are my priorities? What am I working on? Document them. You help say, okay, this is a priority. What are we going to put away? And I think we've got to be a little bit ruthless in that and saying, what can we achieve in this current environment? Ambiguity and uncertainty, for example. The challenge is, as humans, we don't like ambiguity. Our brain likes certainty. We like to know what we're going to do. So in this environment, that doesn't mean we just have to go, oh, I can't do anything. It's like, no, let's set up. I don't know what the future looks like at the moment, but what I can do for my team at this very moment is set up those regular routines and rhythms that they know. As I said before, we're going to have a morning muster at 9 o'clock every morning. And yes, we're going to have our phones on, our cameras on, so I can do a visual check on how people are tracking. And so we're not losing the stuff that we would get in the office. And so trying to make things as certain as possible. I don't know what the government's going to put out. I don't know what we look like in a month's time. But what I can tell you right here is this is the advice we've got, and here's my guidance. As soon as I hear of new information, I will share that with you. And I think that, I mean, we are practicing this ourselves. So in our team, we're actually in Mappian, we're navigating this as well. So Blake leads the team, the musters, and he'll come in. The first thing he says, I haven't got an update to give you. So what that simple statement does is gives people the confidence that as soon as Blake gets information, it'll be shared with us. So that gives, it's a tiny thing, but he's creating and reinforcing the message that I'll give it to you when I can, and creating that perception, and it is accurate, the transparency of the process, which is what people need. Changes in tasks. How are we supporting people at the moment if I have a change in task? So think about what we need to learn. We need this part of our brain, which requires so much more energy than our primal, our older part of the brain. So I don't have as much capacity to learn. So be kind to ourselves and just give ourselves that little bit of extra time. So, but the best side we can go to, if we go to the next part, Blake, is this is where we know that we can get engagement, and this is what the really strong motivators are. So if we work with the resources. So one of the things at the moment, we don't have a lot of capacity around the financial compensation for people. A lot of organisations just don't have that capacity. But are there other forms of compensation we can be giving people to incentivise? Independence for me is about autonomy. It's like giving me control over my work. And I tap into participation here. If you have a job that is high demand, then the best thing you can do to help, and this is what research shows, is that if you give autonomy, more control over how a person, flexibility, how do I do my job? When do I do my job? Help me participate in defining what my job is. Those elements help balance out the job demands and help the person become engaged. Really critical here is our relationships with colleagues and supervisors, and I'll couple that with information and communication as well, because we're in a potentially heightened emotional state, which means I can misinterpret. If we're not using or misinterpret intent, we'll hear a message, put it through our own lens, and maybe come out with a different conclusion than what the intention was of the person. So really critically, we have to be communicating, going, can I just check in? When you said that, I thought you meant that. And the person, oh, no, that wasn't my intention. So really clear communication with people, and in different forms. It's multi-channel. It's not just send an email or 3 emails. It's about picking up the phone and going, hey, how's it going? How's that task going? So I think that this is a really strong model that we need. And this is one that we actually measure. We've got a wellbeing, working from home kind of wellbeing survey. And so it's based on this particular one, so that we can actually track, and we do it in our team as well, to see, well, how are we tracking? How are we making sure objectively, if I can't get as much contact, give me a tool that will help me to understand how my team members are going. I think one of the main concerns I have at the moment is that we're still in just that transactional space, and that we're just going, what's the task? When's the due date? All those pragmatic things, without really going, okay, Blake, what's happening for you? How you doing? You've got young kids. It normally takes, I remember one morning a story Blake said, normally takes 2 hours in the morning to do schooling with one of his little ones, but they had a bad morning, and so it took to 12:30. So then as an employee, where's the rest of your day? You're exhausted already, and so it's about understanding where that person is, and just trying to help people through that without going, oh, you didn't deliver on that. So it's really about empathy at the moment, I think, and a bit of kindness and tolerance, I think, is the word that's been consistently used.
Absolutely. And I think you're sort of balancing out that sense of the language and the words aren't really new, from a sense of how we need to be guiding and leading and supporting our workforce. So this research, this advice is really what we provide teams, that are at peak performance and wanting to maintain that level of peak performance. It's probably the balancing of some of the, like, as you mentioned, the empathy coming through. And I think that's where Diane, being on the ground, and I think where, as a counsellor, you have this enormous privilege, I suppose, of where people really get very vulnerable, with yourself. And where you're helping that individual, you know, through this challenge. What are the ways of thinking, and then also those practical behaviors or techniques that you would say, this is the stuff that works, and this is how we can help right now?
Yeah. I think two of the most important things that we can do now is maintain connection and engagement with our teams in a remote working style, and also really up our communication. I think Lisa has beautifully talked about the different ways in which we need to communicate. And one of the most important things that we're missing out on being in a remote working environment is we're missing out on all of the non-verbal information. So what I'm talking about here is body posture, it's gesticulation with the arms, it's facial expression. And so when we think about the ways in which we're communicating, what we want to do is use those forms of communication where we can get the most nonverbal information. Of course, that's video. So that would be the best way of communicating right now. But in terms of where people are at with their emotions, for leaders at the moment, I think the two words are flexibility and empathy. So everybody is going through this in their own unique way and will express that stress and emotion in their own unique way as well. So what we need to do is, put ourselves in the shoes of another person, and don't automatically judge behaviors at face value. We need to just step back another layer behind and go, wow, this behavior is unusual, or it's unexpected. I wonder what is going on for that person to make them behave in that way. So, for example, if we see a decrease in productivity, let's not automatically think that somebody is being lazy. Let's think, okay, what else is going on in their life right now? What other stresses that they are under that might be contributing to this drop-off in productivity? And let's talk about that. So a strategy that is really useful for leaders at this time is something called co-regulation. And we actually do this already, particularly those people who have kids. We co-regulate with our kids all the time. And what that means is that we meet somebody where they're at in terms of their emotion, and we allow them to have their emotion and just be alongside them with that emotion. And then what we do is we help them to move out of it. So for leaders, that means listening and providing the psychological safety for somebody to be able to share their experience with you. So the best way that we can do that as leaders is to exercise vulnerability and transparency ourselves. So saying, yep, you know what, I had a bad day yesterday too. I really struggled last week with the amount of work that I feel I've got at the moment. I understand that, we're going to have bad days and we're going to have good days. So please talk to me on those days when you're not feeling so great, and let's work through it together. So it's really observing the differences in behavior that we need to be watching out for as leaders, and accepting that that's going to be the case, meeting people where they're at, and creating that psychological safety for transparency about for people to talk about their own individual experience.
Excellent. And as you're sharing that practical advice there, I was just taking a couple of notes, and would encourage people, if there were any particular types of questions about some of the interventions that you might be considering or experiencing right now, to thread them through. And there is that sort of element of the F word, in terms of that, is quite easy to remember, as being that key theme practically, through that sense of getting used to asking the question a lot. That sort of element of, I really love the sort of sentiment that Diane mentioned in terms of that sense of, we're all experiencing this situation differently. So it's sort of a bit of an oxymoron in terms of, we know that from the research, there's this list of things that can help, but we can't expect them to be adopted and by people the same way all the time. And that's where the power of empathy can help people pause enough to start shifting what they might be doing to something new. And I think when what I love about working, with diverse teams, and someone like Mark sort of stepping in as that sense of, with this high level of empathy, this high level of tolerance, where you mentioned earlier that sense of there are behaviours now that are okay that never used to be. This is something that can kind of create the unintended consequence, of being accommodating, compassionate, empathetic, with a broad group of people. Now, from your perspective, did you want to add to the item in terms of what you're noticing in terms of some of these unintended consequences, and how you might have thought, oh, if only they had, some of the types of preventative items that would have helped there?
Yeah, thanks, Blake. I think one of the key points that has been made a couple of times is that monitoring performance is really difficult in these circumstances. It's also really challenging for leaders to be able to understand the personal circumstances and pressures that are challenging an employee at the time. It's hard to seek an understanding about the personal circumstances, because if you're trying to be supportive and try to get understanding about the circumstances, where's the fine line between prying too far into people's personal circumstances? It wouldn't be a big stretch to escalate from, trying to get to the core of the personal issues to, is it becoming a little bit is it bordering on becoming inappropriate? As an employer or as a manager, are you delving too deeply? So, and that comes back to, we're not in a normal time. Emotions are more heightened. So an employer may not need to know these sort of things, or be an employee may not be as sensitive. People, I think at the moment, what we're finding is initially people are tolerant of the current situation. People know, people are fairly empathetic. We're all in the same boat. We've all got these huge challenges. Let's just hope we go back to normal soon. But as that carries on, poor performers and or those seen to be taking an advantage of the lack of physical supervision, other employees who are doing the right thing or are high performers may become resentful that they think that people are, going for taking this situation or taking advantage of the situation. So, we've got to be very mindful of that. An employer may have, have all good intention of supporting employees who may have these challenges of work from home, but they may be perceived by colleagues as getting a free ride. And, that really is something as a manager, we've got to be able to balance. Also, at these times of insecurity, staff may be reluctant to actually raise concerns. If we go back to the first point about financial insecurity, there could well be a mindset of, I don't want to say anything now. I don't want to put my head up because, I don't want to do anything to jeopardize what may happen to the future. And that may be a totally unfounded fear, but it could be a natural fear that, I don't want to be seen as someone who's rocking the boat. And what that may do is let issues fester that may result in more serious issues down the track. So regular and effective communication is a key. As Lisa was saying, regular team catch-ups and also one-on-one checks are essential more than ever. And as a manager, try to be clear in your expectations, and which means true two-way communication is essential. That means also being a good listener. Be empathetic, but also be clear about accountabilities. That's really where, we use the phrase trusted leader. At times like this is when a trusted leader comes to the fore. We need to talk to our people. We need to push the one-on-ones, especially where people may become uncomfortable. I think we need to persevere with that and don't be scared of, those sort of conversations where, you know, there could be a little bit, you know, normal circumstances to be uncomfortable. But, you know, it's okay to ask, you know, ask open questions, get people talking, make sure you listen actively. You know, what that means is, you know, as Diane said, you know, encourage empathy by also showing vulnerability. You know, that we're all going through a difficult time, and, you know, being able to, you know, get that trust is, you know, showing, you know, that we're all in the same boat. You know, it's about encouragement and support at this time.
Can I just pick up on that as well, if that's okay? Just one really quick point, is that psychological safety. At the moment, we are in a really unique position, and we have to be really careful that we don't lose our culture, particularly if we've got a really strong, healthy culture. At these times, we're going to see behaviours that maybe aren't the best or what's expected coming from, and it's kind of just reinforcing what everyone said, is that come from a place of understanding, but it doesn't mean we accept poor behaviour. So, and that's why we've got to be a little bit courageous and transformational and find out what's happening for people, and then talk about what's okay and what's not okay. So even going back and looking at, well, do we need new values now that define our behaviours? So, you know, there's lots of new challenges there. But I think, Mark, you just made some fantastic points there, and that fear is that I just go silent and I just tolerate, which gets simmering. And I can see Diane to pick up. Yeah.
Yeah. One point I wanted to make, and just I was listening to you guys talk, is that I think it's really important here to make a distinction between what is a work in progress discussion and what is a coaching discussion. So the work in progress discussions are the one that we have all the time. It's like, how are you going with this project? What resources do you need? When is the deadline? What has the client said? That is a work in progress conversation. That is about tasks and getting things done. What we're talking about is having a coaching conversation, which is very coach-y focused, and it's about, how are you going? How can we support you? What do you need from us? What are you finding challenging right now? And these are two separate conversations. They're not the same conversation. So we need to really focus on having those coaching conversations. They're the harder ones. It's very easy to have a work in progress conversation. So we need to be aware that we're doing both.
Absolutely. If I can pick up, so in our language, I would call that the task and monitoring and all of that sits in the transactional landscape, and we must do it. Do not misunderstand. We've got to have that. But where you want to spend the majority of your time, which is in the transformational space, which is in coaching, acting with integrity, building trust in your relationship, all of those, visioning for the future. Where are we going now, guys? So that's where you need to spend most of your time. So I think that's beautiful. Different language, but same construct. So.
And I think this is sort of leading into a really beautiful tactic, I think, right now, in terms of, you know, what is working right now is a higher proportion of the coaching conversations where we're asking about yourself. And there's a couple of questions coming up, Diane, that I might sort of send your way. And so what I'm sort of hearing is that sense of, we've got to have the accountability conversations. We've got to have the coaching conversations. We know for a fact that some people are better at task over coaching, or coaching over task. So there's an item there that most of the time, you know, when people are in a threatened state, they'll do what they're good at, you know, so they'll go with what the normal is. So whether we're a leader or an HR leader supporting leaders en masse to have a bigger impact, there's that coaching conversation where people have a really clear frame of how to have that conversation, then move into task, you know, is really quite key. And as we move into at the moment, high proportion of coaching is what the recommendation actually is, you know, from evidence, research, our experience today. And then, but familiarizing people, you know, where Diane mentioned habits are really important right now. We're getting into the habit of recognizing when I'm talking about my feelings, when I'm having a conversation that's coaching related, and that which is related to task. Those are the three really familiar conversations I'm having right now. And that's the ratio that we're going to start to adapt and move, you know, as we move through this. And so coming back to Diane too, the question was that sense of, you know, working from home is a high proportion, of the workforce right now. And one of the tips that we've shared in an earlier webinar is the sense of, as you're managing that transition, it's sort of recognizing what you might call as reasonable risk. So based on experience that you've had with team members in the past, who are those that might be more prone to a particular mental health risk, that might help you sort of think about particular ways of engaging them. And so someone raised a question about a particular segment of the workforce who, that they live alone, and that work provides them with a very strong sense of personal identity and professional identity. And so for them, working from home, being isolated, a coping strategy might be just trying to win the productivity contest. Others, might sort of cope through withdrawal. We can cope or respond in different ways, all of which is a putting a hand up for help. What's your advice, I guess, for helping those people right now?
So what we're looking for is primarily differences in usual behaviour. Some people will cope very, very well with all of the change that's going on, and some people won't, of course. Those people at work that you notice where their emotions a little bit more on their sleeve might be the ones who you need to keep a closer eye on. Those people who really like a lot of structure, who like a lot of direction, who like a lot of detail in the way that they work, might struggle in these situations. So, it's always been the case that knowing your people is the greatest skill you can have as a leader. And this has never been more relevant than now, because what we need to be able to see is when people are struggling, knowing what we know about them. So the second part of the question was about people who are living alone. So we always want to have those team check-ins and those one-on-one check-ins as well. But another great strategy is actually to buddy people up. So have two people that may also already have a relationship at work to actually buddy up and check in on each other on a daily basis. Now, what that means is that you're kind of sharing the responsibility of looking after each other. It also means that you will definitely have that contact with that person every day. But it also allows those two people to develop the relationship and the rapport to create that psychological safety, to create that trust where the conversations can be more open. Because whether we like it or not, there are some people in our team that won't want to talk to the boss about what's going on for them. And we have to acknowledge that as well. So if we, buddy people up who are peers, we do create the opportunity for that transparency and communication.
If I can also add to that, particularly for the last point about the socialization aspect, we are losing a lot of the, having a cup of coffee in the kitchen, just bumping into each other, things like that. Well, I'm starting to see, and we're doing it ourselves, is having coffee catch-ups with people. So it's actually just taking 15 minutes, whatever it is, just to check in with people. We are having this, I think we've actually got an event. Our team does a Friday wind down. So we actually meet, virtually, and we have a glass of wine together and just check in. And we say how we're going and, what's the next week. And, those kinds of bring back the social element. If we have a monthly birthday celebrations, we'll keep those going, guys. Just do it virtually. So it's just keep those connections.
Excellent. And I think in terms of listening to the stories right now, I'm tapping out some of those really, if you have a checklist coming out of today, some of the things that we could start doing at that tactical and behavioral level, and tactically it is that sense of, really starting to prepare our workforce around the style of conversations to have right now, in terms of coaching, task, and checking in about information about the future. The buddying up, love that concept in terms of really appreciating the challenge of if leaders are always going to be the ones who are delivering the most support. So we need to sort of strengthen that. And I guess that other aspect about ramping up the video conferencing, it's that sort of sense of that choice might not be the easiest option to take, given the burden of workload. And I guess challenging that sense of if we up the video con, people are receiving more feedback and personal connection. That's what drives one's resources to innovate and create and become more productive. And that's the anti-intuitive part of leadership right now, if I'm sort of putting together that emotion and leadership behavior front. And that's where I sort of would steer into the next question. And this is one that is crystal ball gazing, and this is the one that media is driving much about the agenda that we're setting personally, and we're seeing America's sort of ramp up of the economy. We're hearing a relaxation, I suppose, of some of the isolation requirements here in Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, whether in an emergency service or a disaster response situation, which most of us are in right now, we sort of find ourselves in this scenario that we can then sort of look at, sorry, I just got distracted by something. But I guess in terms of that sense of, there's an appetite now to start to plan for recovery. We start to plan for it before we're in there. So the questions we were preparing for and starting to get right now is that, okay, whether it's June 1, someone said to me yesterday, or whether it's May, recovery starting, we're not sure how it's going to look. We're planning for that right now. What do we need to know? And I guess that's that sort of element of, we've been sharing the tactics in terms of what's working right now. And that advice, that feedback is working right now and will continue to work, for that next sort of 2 to 4 week period. I suppose it's that element of bringing a sense of predictability to people who are at the front line, really driving this recovery well. I guess my question would be thrown to Diane first, in terms of that element, in terms of what is it that people right now need to be thinking about to be on the front foot?
So first thing is, I just want to say, isn't it amazing how rapidly we changed from the situation that we had to the situation we're in now? And in a lot of ways, it has actually forced us to understand what we're capable of. And I think that's very exciting. And I think we will carry that forward. The other thing that has happened is that organisations that may have been dragging their feet in terms of flexible working arrangements have now been forced into engaging in it and realise that actually it's not so bad, and there are advantages to having it. And the reason I say this is because when we go back to whatever normal will look like after all this is over, it will be different from before. And so essentially what will happen is that we will start the change curve all over again. So we will, because what we've gone through that initial, let's call it trauma of change, and we've started to develop our routines, and we're kind of settling into this new way of work. So as we then go through the next phase of change, which is going to be discovering our new business as usual, there will be that unease, there will be that uncertainty, there will be that unpredictability and anxiety around what our new normal is going to look like. So what we need to do is make sure that we communicate broadly about what's going to happen. We take change in small steps. We will have the luxury of easing back in this time, whereas, we had to do it really rapidly when we changed to remote working, but we will have the opportunity to ease back into our new way of being. So I think those are the really main points, is to communicate widely, broadly, be as transparent as you can, give people as much certainty as you can about what the future will look like. Chunk it down into small pieces of change and take your time with it to make sure that we get through that first part of the change curve with as little anxiety and exhaustion as possible.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And I'm just mindful of time, in terms of the webinar, and there's definitely time for us to hang around with questions. And I just put to Lisa and then Mark those final words of advice that we do need to be thinking about right now in preparation for recovery. And I guess there's that sort of sense of it's balancing between that trust, empathy, and then also flexibility, I suppose, on that equation that you added to it, Diane. We've got that side of the equation, productivity, accountability, with mental health and recovery at the centre, building on the advice from Diane. Any other sort of key words there?
Got me. I was doing so well with the mute button. No, I think we are in a really, really unique position. And as Diane said, we are not going back to the way things were. So I think if we go back and we think about the job demands model from a first port of call, it's like, get people involved. Let's start looking at, look at your strategy, look at your vision. Organizations have had to morph and shape. Do you have the same offers of service and things like that at the moment? Look at what are our values, look at what are the behaviors, the culture that we need to have. And I think we are in this space, if I talk to just a slide I was talking about, we have to lead with trust and empathy. Trust our people, keep the communication going, and we are absolutely needing people to be performing, but understanding these are unique times. And I think leading, transformational leadership, understanding, empathy, trust, we've got to just really support people through this. And yeah, there's going to come a time where we're going to get, okay, we really need to be performing better now. But if you're doing the right sort of leadership, such as transformational leadership in the right space and transactional, you'll get those extra behaviors from people that you're looking for. People want to work. And it's really healthy for our mental health that we stay engaged in the workplace. So it's about how do we lead people through this. And so we're in a unique position. And I think we should be leveraging this and using the team and where we need to go and doing it together, because we are in it together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I think the important part of it is not being this sort of doom and gloom of the mental health. There's definitely that sense of empathy for people who are struggling right now. And the proactive planning, building these early habits now and using those habits to create the resources that we need to shape a better future, so that we will get through this stronger as we do. I think in terms of, we started to play with this word accountability, and I think if we were to look at a webinar, say in 4 to 6 weeks, it's likely to be based on questions, thinking, conversations, how are we holding people to account in this new world? It doesn't feel right at this point in time to be training people in these accountability conversations because of the genuine humanistic nature of a lot of people right now, appreciating what we're really going through. But then this strain from an economy perspective, and a sense of realization or acceptance of where we're at and what it looks like to ramp up, ramp forward, to be robust and resilient to improve. I think that's where, from your perspective, Mark, it's that, I guess, well, you've got a lot of brilliant stories that you share to help really paint the picture of why a lot of the tactics that we advise to support people need to have this thread of process, standardization, and thinking about where it has gone wrong before, to help us. And I think although we're in untapped times, there's an element here where, whether it's a go live, new structure, this period of transition, it's kind of like recovery sets this go live, and there's a breath of, oh, we're here now, finally. And then this really swift realization of, oh my gosh, there's so much work to come, and the more we plan for that right now, the better we're going to be, and beat that curve. And that sense of, from an HR perspective, where you're seeing some of the favoritism elements being brought up, some of the performance challenges being brought up. What should we be really thinking about from a process policy perspective, in terms of dealing with performance and accountability? That strikes as good a balance as we can get around that accountability and empathy side.
Okay, Blake, I think, the all-encompassing sort of concept of, which lens we look through is, it's the concept of reasonable management action. That concept doesn't change in these circumstances. but the circumstances change, because reasonable management action is an objective test. So it's about, all the circumstances of each situation must be taken into account. I think that's really important. That means consider things in a measured and thoughtful way. As I mentioned earlier, seek advice. Don't worry if you don't know the answer. Know where you can get that trusted advice. And sometimes, when people are challenged in difficult times, the concept of going back to or reverting to a black and white answer for questions that are very grey can be a real trap. You've got to be flexible, but within reason, of course. And you talk about my anecdotes. I've got this an example of a poor judgment and a decision-making process that took place in a major government agency just recently. A long-term employee with no performance issues has been part of the team where the team are all remote from each other. And there are a number of agencies across Australia where your team may be in a different state. You're not sitting, you might be in a pod, but they're in totally different teams. So this person was working remote from each other. The team was across all different locations. When the isolation period first started, people went and worked from home, and including this one individual. There were no technical issues, and the person also had family responsibilities, children at home. A new instruction came down from government, which basically said that employees may work from home. The next day, that employee's manager was directed to go and work back at the office. That means catching public transport. This is at the height of where we're looking at, down south, looking at 100 new cases a day. You had to work out issues with the kids and was pretty much alone in a big office. And she raised objections and was told, may is a discretionary word, so it's not an entitlement. So that was the answer. No reasoning, just it's my say, and I'm saying you have to work in the office, which may well be legally and technically correct, but it's not a great way to gain team support. And that person has since left the role, and that sort of reversion to when things get, difficult, you have to be mindful of not to go back to just say no and we work it out from here, or just what's black and white. And as mentioned, the big challenges from now is, how do we reintegrate into a more normalised form of working? Will we go back to where we were? Are the mutual gains, as Diane said, some people are thinking, hey, this is pretty good. Working from home, I can get a lot more done. I'm taking out, 2 hours of travel time. Are there mutual gains for both employees and employers to continue in some of these more flexible practices? Will that mean revisiting our policies or our employment contracts, or when they expire, do we have to have more provisions in the agreement, or can we use current provisions to look at flexibility down the track? That sort of work has to be done. We need to plan, and we need to work with staff to reshape what we're doing and how we want it to work. And it is a fine line, but an opportunity to reach a balance between productivity, empathy, and accountability. We need to have clear goals, clear ways of keeping us all on track for those goals within a framework of productivity and accountability. And also consider what flexibilities will support those goals, but also what flexibilities, while supporting the goals, also make life easier for employees. How do we support flexibility requests while still maintaining accountability? And I think after this, such requests might be more difficult to refuse, because we've demonstrated, I think, as a workforce, that things working in a different way can still work. And so, where a lot of, whether it's state legislation or federal legislation, the requests for flexible working arrangements, the bar may be a bit higher for an employer to say no, or they may have to give more detailed and more considered answers. So, it's all ahead of us about, it's a real, I think, a time for, a mutual gains look at how we work to the future.
Excellent. And I think what I'm sort of loving about that, the sort of, I guess the advice right now is where we're all coming from different areas of expertise, and I'm pushing you to that area of expertise, but then we're all landing in the middle, in terms of that sort of element of, regardless of that specific advice that we bring, we're at the moment of art over science, where we're going to be better artists with an appreciation of the science, but really trusting that human instinct right now for what people need. And everything that we've trained for in life can help build that self-control that we need right now to perhaps pause where that instinct might be taking us towards that wrong way than the better way. And so I think in terms of that sense of where HR, counseling, neuroscience, leadership and culture are sort of joining together, is that sense of more conversations, listen hard, create the habits of speaking about our feelings and starting to build ourselves to increase that ratio of some of the accountability conversations as people are ready, appreciating that's different. And I think the key thing you spoke about there, Mark, where we need our people and processes and leaders to be connected right now at the moment, is this recognition that it's kind of not going to be business as usual, this business as usual, or this new business as usual means that a lot of the processes that we used to apply may not be as effective. And if we do try to apply them, it might slip us back. And that is we've sort of experienced unprecedented behaviors, unprecedented change, and the capacity, and this is one of the key pieces of advice that Lisa has shared with me internally in the team, but then also with clients, is that sense of, critical incidents shape people and culture. When a lot of people are watching and a lot of people are going to be affected, how we respond right now will have echoes and ripples, at an individual, team and organizational level. And finding a way that sort of right now, in that sense of, when I look back at COVID, I'm bloody proud of myself, my team, the business. No one was perfect. Nobody ever is. It's our values that provide a level of guidance to test our best about some of the decisions we have to make. And then more importantly, how we go about implementing them. And some of the field research with clients also to sort of highlight the importance of values right now is where, when employees genuinely believe that values exist and followed, they're more comfortable speaking up about mental health. They're more comfortable speaking up about some of the issues that they think to be resolved in the business. So I think that with that in mind, of avoiding the waffle, but trying to do the wrap up and sort of give a window for our other panelists just to pop in, I guess, with a closing remark or comment to leave you with right now. I've done a quick scan of some of the questions and there aren't any more coming through. So I guess I'd sort of, the key point there is that the businesses I've been working with that sort of look at this as we're not going back to normal. We're needing to arm our leaders and teams, and this is really being driven by HR right now, with the capacity to be as flexible as possible and listen hard right now, so that recovery is a shared journey, not a prescriptive one. So I guess good one, Lisa. So we've kind of got the 10 minutes left. We're going pretty good on time, but this is that sort of, I'm a structured person, going off the script. We'll sort of bounce where we go and see where we land, and encourage any questions as well, so that we can speak to you. So, Lisa.
I think you make really good points there, and I completely agree with you, is that at the moment, we, as leaders in the business, influencers, business owners, things like that, our behaviour, how we're behaving is absolutely under the microscope. And if I come back to it, something that Diane first said, it was about, we've got to take care of ourselves. And I think you've got to give yourself, but you've got to give yourself oxygen before you can take care of other people. And when I hear about the stressors that people are experiencing, what's happening in our brain, if we aren't sleeping well, if we're not exercising, if we're not eating well and doing all the things, we don't have the resources just to manage the challenges in front of us. So we are shaping the culture right now. How I speak to staff is critical, how I lead through this. And I think that we've got to take care of ourselves in order to be able to take care of others. And there's a lot of research around interventions, specific interventions. Happy to talk to people offline if they want, around individual, team and organisational, how we develop a healthy well-being culture within an organisation. But I think at the moment it's take care of yourself and then take care of your team. So that was it.
Right. No, I was going to throw to Diane, and just with that little sort of transition too, in that, you know, the conversation has all been about mental health and not mental illness. You know, and it does talk to the spectrum and the way of looking right now. So I guess just wanted to make that comment, and that from Diane, your perspective, you know, in terms of that, you know, when you're hearing those stories from people reaching out right now, and you had that sort of wish to go, oh, it'd be so great, you know, if organisations could hear this, you know, and bring this empathy into some of the ways that they're looking to recovery. What would that wish be?
Oh, gosh, that's actually a big question.
Shorten it. Feel free to shorten it.
I wish for everything that we've talked about today.
World peace.
Yeah. And as we're talking about world peace, let's talk about Gandhi. Be the change that you want to see in the world. Culture is set within organisations from the top down. So as leaders, we need to be responsible for being the role models for the way that we want people to interact. We also need to accept that everybody is human, including ourselves. So I think the general across the board advice to everybody is be gentle with yourselves. We are not going to be operating at 100% right now. Some days we might get lucky and have a great day, but we've got to manage our expectations around what we're actually really capable of right now, be realistic about it, and also apply those concepts to our people as well. Fitting your own oxygen mask is the perfect metaphor here. We need to take care of ourselves before we are able to take care of other people. And, you know, the best way that we can do that is actually being proactive around our lifestyle as well. So we need to make sure that we're giving ourselves the resources to be able to do all of these wonderful behaviors. So that means looking after your diet. I think one of the hardest things for me right now is an open pantry. So all of the answers to every problem I have are behind those two little doors. And so we need to be making sure that we are deliberate about, you know, making sure we have those good 3 meals a day, we're drinking enough water, we're moving our body. Exercise is a great way of discharging anxious energy and also upping those beautiful endorphins. But if I had to pick one thing, it would be get some sleep. Sleep is incredibly rejuvenating and refreshing. And the more we sleep before midnight, actually, the more refreshing our sleep is. So if you can go to bed earlier and then get up earlier the next day, you are actually going to feel more refreshed just because of the way that our sleep cycles work. And I have one other recommendation, which is take a nap. We are in the beautiful situation right now where at any time of the day, we can just take a nap for 20 minutes and nobody will bat an eyelid. So let's capitalize on that, but there are rules. You can only nap for 20 minutes. So you got to set your clock and you only sleep for 20 minutes or nap for 20 minutes because we can only get into a very light cycle of sleep in 20 minutes. If we sleep for longer, we start to go into that really deep delta wave sleep, and it's actually harder to get out of that. And so that's when we wake up feeling a little bit worse than we were before we lay down for a nap. So take a nap through the day, and it's great for generating insight, great for regenerating those resources in our prefrontal cortex for only 20 minutes.
And how do you keep the kids away for that 20 minutes?
I don't know.
iPads. Or YouTube.
They have a radar for that sort of thing.
and, and I think, I just sort of would add to that sort of element of, resetting expectations is really important right now. And those of us who are homeschooling, when you're given that roster, of lessons, it gives a sense of structure. And where it might be that sense of what that new routine looks like at home can be really helpful. But then also in terms of resetting operational requirements, trying to do that in our own team, doing it now felt really clumsy, a bit weird, didn't come off as intended. But the recognizing that didn't have the intent, didn't reach the intent, kind of gave us something to talk about, that then enabled it to get onto the right swim lane. The intent was shared, and we actually had a much better sort of conversation. I think it's that sort of element of it can feel a bit clunky in some of these new sort of behaviors we're displaying right now. And when delivered with the right intent, people will kind of give you a way to kind of talk you both or the team, onto the right track. And so making lots of mistakes right now is okay. And those mistakes is just us learning, so think of the mistakes more as training as opposed to mistakes. And Mark, words of wisdom from yourself right now?
In typical IR fashion, I'll be a little bit of a downer in that, for all your good efforts and good intentions, there may come the occasions where the concerns are not resolved and you receive formal complaints. You have to deal with it. It's a bigger issue not to deal with it. Seek advice. Don't be afraid of technology. Mediation, investigations, they can all be done remotely. And that's certainly what we're finding, that, whilst it's not perfect, it still works. So what I'm trying to say is that you still will get really difficult situations, and there's ways to deal with it.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. I don't think it's a downer, it's the reality. And I love that that sense of, if there was a rule of thumb at the moment, we're erring on the side of trust, empathy, flexibility, letting mistakes happen, and that will occur, and when the unintended consequences arise, we've got the resources, and the capacity to respond, aligned with values, and, how the IR landscape would advise us in the best interest of the business. So really appreciate everybody's time today logging in, panel members for sharing your expertise. As a proud Aussie, I also shared, there is a genuine level of investment into a lot of community services that also translate into the workplace as well, who are delivering some exceptional resources, for everybody right now. And, if there was anything that you were going to do after this session, hopefully we've provided you with an opportunity to ask someone, are you okay? Have a chat about what we chatted about. And that'll make a difference, to someone today, and the ripple effect of that will, transform, I guess, emotions around the world right now. So thanks everybody. We wish you much safety, and all the best in recovery, and see you soon.